Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Sierra Nevada. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1850, when the California gold rush was at its peak and thousands of fortune seekers flooded the Sierra Nevada mountains, a peculiar incident was recorded in the sparse documentation of Tuolumne County. The case involved two prospectors whose partnership would end in circumstances so disturbing that local authorities chose to archive the file without further investigation. What began as a routine missing person report would reveal a pattern of behavior that challenged every assumption about human nature under extreme conditions. The story emerges from fragments of testimony, scattered journal entries, and witness accounts that paint a picture of isolation, desperation, and a slow descent into something that defies categorization. Among the 100 most common names in mid-19th century America, sorted and selected through methodical process, we find Harold Costner and Benjamin Drury, two men whose fates became intertwined in the remote wilderness of the Sierra foothills, far from civilization's watchful eye. Harold Costner, aged 28, arrived in California from Ohio in the spring of 1849. According to ship manifests from San Francisco, he traveled alone, carrying little more than basic mining equipment and a worn leather journal that would later provide crucial insights into his mental state. Benjamin Drury, 31, had been working various claims throughout the Sierra Nevada for nearly 2 years when he encountered Costner at a supply depot in what is now known as Sonora. The partnership formed quickly, as was common among prospectors who found strength in numbers against the harsh mountain conditions. Drury possessed experience with the terrain and seasonal patterns, while Costner brought fresh energy and modest funding. Together, they filed a claim on a remote creek approximately 15 miles northeast of the main settlement, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that wound through dense forest and rocky outcroppings. Contemporary records from the Tuolumne County Clerk's office show their claim was registered on May 13, 1850. The location, described in surveyor's notes as exceedingly isolated, requiring 2 days' hard travel from nearest habitation, offered both promise and peril. Previous prospectors had reported modest gold deposits in the area, but none had remained through a full winter season due to the extreme conditions and complete isolation from supply lines. The last confirmed sighting of both men occurred in early September, when they appeared at Morrison's trading post to purchase winter supplies. The storekeeper, Thomas Morrison, later testified that Costner seemed agitated and spoke repeatedly about keeping watch and protecting what's ours. Drury remained largely silent during the transaction, but appeared thinner than when Morrison had last seen him in July. The men purchased an unusual quantity of salt, preserved meat, and rifle ammunition before disappearing back into the wilderness. Winter arrived early that year, with heavy snows beginning in October and continuing through March. The mountain passes became impassable, and no contact with the outside world was possible until the spring thaw. It was common for prospectors to winter alone in their claims, emerging only when conditions permitted. Therefore, their absence raised no immediate concern among the sparse population of nearby settlements. The first indication that something had gone wrong came in April of 1851. When a group of prospectors discovered Costner wandering alone along a creek bed nearly 20 miles from his original claim. He appeared severely malnourished and exhibited signs of exposure and psychological distress. His clothing was torn and inadequate for mountain conditions, and he carried no supplies or equipment. When questioned about Drury's whereabouts, Costner provided inconsistent accounts. Initially, he claimed his partner had left the claim in February to seek supplies and had never returned. Later, he stated that Drury had fallen ill and died during the winter, and that he had buried him near their cabin. A third version suggested that Drury had abandoned the partnership and fled with their accumulated gold. The contradictions in his testimony raised immediate suspicions among local authorities. A search party was organized and dispatched to the claim site. What they discovered defied explanation and would haunt the participants for years afterward. The cabin the men had constructed showed signs of hasty abandonment, with personal belongings scattered throughout and evidence of a struggle near the doorway. Most disturbing were the numerous bear tracks surrounding the structure and what appeared to be human bone fragments scattered in the nearby brush. Inside the cabin, investigators found Costner's journal, which had been updated regularly throughout the winter months. The entries began normally, documenting daily mining activities and weather conditions. However, as winter progressed, the tone became increasingly paranoid and erratic. Costner wrote extensively about Drury's changing behavior, claiming his partner had become secretive and threatening. References to food shortages became frequent, along with descriptions of Drury's alleged attempts to hoard supplies. The journal entries from January 1851 took on a decidedly darker character. Costner described elaborate plans to deal with the threat and wrote at length about observing bear behavior in the area. He documented the animals' feeding patterns, their territorial nature, and their attraction to certain types of bait. One particularly unsettling entry described an experiment in which scraps of preserved meat were placed at varying distances from the cabin to observe bear response. By February, the entries had become fragmented and difficult to interpret. Costner wrote about solving the problem permanently and made repeated references to feeding time and nature taking its course. The final legible entry, dated February 28th, contained only the words, "Benjamin understands now. The bears are grateful. Spring will bring freedom." Physical evidence at the scene supported a horrifying interpretation of these cryptic writings. Investigators found remnants of rope that had been cut, not worn through naturally. Bloodstains near the cabin's entrance had been partially scrubbed but remained visible. Most damning was the discovery of human teeth among the bear scat in the immediate vicinity, identified by a traveling dentist as consistent with dental work Drury had received in San Francisco. The bear population in that particular area was known to be unusually large and aggressive. Local hunters reported that the animals had become increasingly bold, approaching human habitation without the typical wariness. This behavior, while noted, had not been considered particularly significant until viewed in the context of Costner's journal entries and the physical evidence at the claim site. When confronted with these findings, Costner's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He began speaking in disjointed fragments about survival, necessity, and the natural order of mountain life. He claimed that Drury had forced him to make an impossible choice and that he had simply let nature decide. Further questioning became impossible as Costner retreated into complete silence, responding to no queries, regardless of their nature. Medical examination revealed that Costner had survived the winter in better physical condition than would have been expected given the alleged food shortages described in his journal. His weight, while below normal, suggested adequate nutrition throughout the isolation period. This observation contradicted his claims of desperate starvation and raised questions about the true nature of the partnership's dissolution. The investigating magistrate, Judge William Hartford, faced an unprecedented legal challenge. While evidence strongly suggested foul play, the circumstances made traditional prosecution extremely difficult. The isolated location, lack of direct witnesses, and Costner's deteriorating mental state created a situation where legal certainty was impossible. The case file notes Hartford's frustration with the ambiguous evidence and the impossibility of achieving justice through conventional means. Additional testimony came from Native American guides who occasionally traveled through the area. They reported observing unusual bear behavior during the winter months, with animals congregating near the claim site and exhibiting aggressive territorial behavior. One guide, speaking through an interpreter, described finding partially consumed human remains during a spring hunt, though he had assumed they belonged to a prospector who had died naturally and been scavenged. The local newspaper, the Sonora Herald, published a brief account of Drury's disappearance in May 1851. The article, constrained by editorial discretion and legal concerns, referred only to a mining accident and the tragic loss of life in the wilderness. No mention was made of the suspicious circumstances or the evidence suggesting deliberate action. The newspaper's archives show that pressure from local business leaders influenced this editorial decision, as graphic details of frontier violence discouraged new settlement and investment. Costner was eventually transported to the state facility in Stockton, where he remained until his death in 1854. Medical records from the institution describe a patient who oscillated between periods of lucidity and complete withdrawal. During his coherent moments, he spoke about the Sierra Nevada wilderness with apparent nostalgia, but refused to discuss his partnership with Drury or the events of that final winter. The claim site was abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the forest. Later prospectors avoided the area, partly due to practical concerns about bear activity and partly due to stories that circulated about the location's history. Maps from the 1860s show the creek renamed from its original designation to Bone Creek, though official records do not explain this change. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, a frontier physician who examined some of the physical evidence, published a paper in 1858 documenting what he termed extreme environmental psychosis. His research, based partly on the Costner case, described how prolonged isolation and survival stress could fundamentally alter human behavior patterns. The paper was archived in the California Medical Society's journals, but gained little attention due to its disturbing subject matter. Letters discovered in Drury's belongings revealed that he had been planning to leave California and return to his family in Pennsylvania. He had written to his sister about his successful prospecting season and his intention to travel east before winter. These letters, postmarked in August 1850, suggest that Drury's disappearance was not voluntary and contradict any theory that he simply abandoned his claim and partner. The investigation officially concluded in September 1851, when Judge Hartford declared the case closed pending new evidence. His private correspondence, discovered decades later in courthouse archives, reveals his belief that Costner had deliberately caused Drury's death, but that legal prosecution was impossible given the circumstances. Hartford wrote to a colleague, "The wilderness has its own justice, terrible and swift, but our courts require certainty that nature rarely provides." The bear population in the area remained unusually large and aggressive for several years following the incident. Hunters and trappers reported animals that showed no fear of humans and seemed to actively seek human contact. This behavior gradually normalized by 1855, though local folklore attributed the change to the conclusion of some unnamed imbalance in the natural order. Forest Service records from the 1920s mention the discovery of human remains near the original claim site during a survey expedition. The bones, scattered and weathered, were assumed to belong to an unknown prospector and were reburied without extensive examination. The location was noted in official records, but marked as unsuitable for recreational development due to unstable terrain and wildlife concerns. A graduate student at the University of California studied the case in 1962 as part of a thesis on frontier justice and psychological breakdown. Her research included interviews with descendants of original witnesses and examination of previously overlooked documents. The thesis was submitted but never published, and the research materials were subsequently lost during a university archive reorganization in 1968. Local hiking guides occasionally mention the story when leading groups through the Sierra Nevada backcountry, though details have been altered through decades of retelling. The location is now within a designated wilderness area where camping is restricted and bear encounters remain common. Park rangers report that visitors often ask about historical incidents in the region, but official policy is to focus on natural history rather than human tragedies. The Costner Journal was photographed and transcribed in 1937 by a Historical Society volunteer, but the original document disappeared sometime during the following decade. The transcription exists in the Tuolumne County Historical Society archives, though access requires special permission and few researchers have examined it in recent years. The document provides the most detailed psychological profile of the case, but raises more questions than it answers. Weather records from the winter of 1850 to 1851 confirm that conditions were particularly severe, with snow depths exceeding normal accumulations by nearly 3 feet. Temperatures remained below freezing for extended periods, and several documented cases of cabin fever occurred among isolated prospectors throughout the Sierra Nevada region. However, none of these other cases resulted in violence or disappearance. The trading post where Costner and Drury made their final supply purchase operated until 1878, when the building was destroyed by fire. Thomas Morrison, the proprietor who testified about their last visit, died in 1861 and left behind detailed records of transactions with various prospectors. His ledger entries for September 1850 note the unusual quantity of salt purchased by the two men, and Morrison's observation that they seemed uncommonly serious about winter preparations. Modern psychological analysis of the available evidence suggests that Costner may have suffered from what contemporary medicine would recognize as severe dissociative disorder triggered by environmental stress. However, such retroactive diagnosis remains speculative, and the true nature of his mental state during the critical winter months cannot be determined with certainty. The Sierra Nevada region continued to attract prospectors throughout the 1850s, though fewer chose to winter alone in remote locations. Stories of the Costner-Drury incident circulated informally among mining communities and contributed to an increased awareness of the psychological dangers of isolation. This awareness likely prevented similar tragedies, though the influence cannot be measured directly. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1980s as part of forest management planning encountered evidence of 19th-century mining activity throughout the area, including remnants of temporary structures and mining equipment. However, no systematic attempt was made to locate or examine the specific site of the 1850 incident, and current environmental protection regulations would prohibit such excavation. The case represents one of the few documented instances of suspected cannibalism-adjacent behavior among California Gold Rush participants, though the indirect nature of the evidence makes definitive conclusions impossible. Similar cases were recorded in other frontier regions during the same period, suggesting that extreme environmental stress could produce similar psychological breakdowns regardless of geographic location. Bears in the Sierra Nevada region today maintain natural wariness of humans and typically avoid contact unless food sources are involved. Wildlife biologists note that the aggressive behavior reported in the 1850s was likely related to environmental factors specific to that time period, including changes in natural food sources and unusual weather patterns that may have disrupted normal animal behavior cycles. The legal precedent established by Judge Hartford's handling of the case influenced later frontier justice decisions throughout California. His emphasis on requiring clear evidence for prosecution, even in cases with strong circumstantial indicators, became a model for other frontier magistrates dealing with similar ambiguous situations. This approach balanced the need for justice with recognition of the unique challenges posed by wilderness crimes. The psychological impact on the search party members who discovered the evidence was documented in several personal letters and diary entries. Many reported nightmares and persistent anxiety following their participation in the investigation. One member, Samuel Brooks, wrote to his brother, "Some sights burn themselves into a man's memory and cannot be forgotten, no matter how much time passes or whiskey is consumed." The transformation of the Sierra Nevada from mining frontier to modern recreational area has obscured many traces of the gold rush era, but the psychological legacy of cases like Costner Drury persists in local folklore. The stories serve as reminders of the thin line between civilization and wilderness behavior, and the unpredictable ways that isolation and stress can affect human judgment. The case file officially remained open until 1967, when a comprehensive review of cold cases led to its closure. No new evidence had emerged in over a century, and all witnesses and participants were deceased. The file was transferred to historical archives, where it remains accessible to researchers willing to navigate the bureaucratic requirements for accessing sensitive historical documents. Educational programs about gold rush history occasionally reference the case as an example of the psychological challenges faced by frontier settlers. However, the graphic nature of the evidence typically results in sanitized presentations that focus on general survival challenges rather than specific details of the Costner Drury incident. This approach preserves the historical value while avoiding potentially disturbing content. The site where Costner was found wandering remains accessible via modern hiking trails, though few visitors are aware of its historical significance. The creek continues to flow through the same granite channels, and the forest has reclaimed any trace of human habitation from that era. Wildlife cameras installed by researchers occasionally capture images of bears moving through the area, following ancient patterns that predate human presence. Scientific understanding of environmental psychology has advanced considerably since 1850, providing context for interpreting historical cases like Costner Drury. Modern research confirms that prolonged isolation combined with survival stress can indeed produce severe behavioral changes, though the specific mechanisms remain subjects of ongoing study. This knowledge helps explain historical incidents while highlighting the importance of mental health support for people in extreme situations. The documentation preserved from the case provides valuable insights into frontier justice systems and their limitations when dealing with ambiguous evidence. The careful balance between protecting society and avoiding wrongful prosecution, demonstrated by Judge Hartford, reflects sophisticated legal thinking despite the primitive conditions. This approach influenced the development of evidence standards that continue to shape American jurisprudence. The seasonal migration patterns of Sierra Nevada wildlife have remained consistent over the centuries, with bears following established routes between summer and winter habitats. The area where the incident occurred lies directly along one of these migration corridors, which may explain both the concentration of bear activity observed in 1851 and the continued wildlife presence today. Genealogical research conducted in the 1990s traced the families of both Costner and Drury, revealing that neither man left direct descendants. Costner died unmarried in the Stockton facility, while Drury had no children, and his family line ended with the death of his sister in Pennsylvania in 1874. This absence of descendants may explain why the case remained obscure for so long. with no family members to preserve or promote awareness of the story. The economic impact of the California gold rush created unprecedented social conditions that challenged traditional moral frameworks. The Costner-Drury case illustrates how quickly social norms could break down when environmental pressures exceeded human adaptive capacity. This breakdown was not unique to their situation, but representative of broader challenges faced by thousands of prospectors who ventured into the Sierra Nevada wilderness. Anthropological studies of frontier communities emphasize the importance of social connections in maintaining psychological stability under stress. The isolation experienced by Costner and Drury eliminated the social support systems that might have prevented their tragic outcome. Their case demonstrates the crucial role that community plays in preserving individual mental health during challenging circumstances. The preservation of historical cases like Costner-Drury serves multiple purposes beyond mere documentation. These records provide insights into human behavior under extreme conditions, illustrate the evolution of legal and social systems, and remind contemporary society of the psychological challenges inherent in isolation and survival situations. The lessons learned from frontier tragedies continue to inform modern approaches to wilderness safety and mental health support. Weather data compilation projects in the 1970s confirmed that the winter of 1850 to 1851 was among the most severe on record for the Sierra Nevada region. Temperature and precipitation measurements from various sources, including military posts and mining settlements, created a comprehensive picture of the extreme conditions faced by isolated prospectors. This data contextualizes the environmental pressures that contributed to the psychological breakdown documented in the Costner-Drury case. The ethical questions raised by the case extend beyond the immediate circumstances of Drury's disappearance to encompass broader issues of survival morality and the limits of human responsibility under extreme duress. Philosophers and ethicists have occasionally referenced similar cases when exploring questions about moral behavior in life-threatening situations. Though the ambiguous evidence makes the Costner-Drury incident less useful for definitional purposes than more clearly documented cases, regional history museums in the Sierra Nevada foothills maintain exhibits about gold rush-era life, though most focus on successful mining ventures and community development rather than tragedies like the Costner-Drury incident. The decision to emphasize positive aspects of frontier history reflects both visitor preferences and community identity considerations, but may result in an incomplete understanding of the period's challenges and human costs. The psychological profiles developed from historical cases like Costner-Drury have contributed to modern wilderness safety protocols and mental health awareness programs. Organizations that operate in remote areas now recognize the importance of monitoring psychological well-being alongside physical safety, implementing systems designed to identify and address stress-related behavioral changes before they become dangerous. The transformation of the Sierra Nevada landscape from mining frontier to recreational wilderness has created new relationships between humans and the environment, but the fundamental challenges of isolation and survival stress remain relevant. Modern backpackers and wilderness enthusiasts face different but analogous psychological pressures, and the historical record provides valuable context for understanding these experiences. Environmental historians studying the impact of gold rush mining on Sierra Nevada ecosystems have noted that areas like the Costner-Drury claim site show remarkable recovery over time. The forest has reclaimed disturbed areas, wildlife populations have stabilized, and natural water flows have resumed their original patterns. This recovery demonstrates the resilience of natural systems while highlighting the temporary nature of human presence in wilderness areas. The documentation methods used to preserve evidence from the Costner-Drury case reflected the limited resources and technical capabilities of 1851 frontier justice systems. Handwritten testimonies, basic sketches, and physical evidence collection relied on individual initiative and attention to detail rather than standardized procedures. Despite these limitations, the preserved materials provide sufficient information for modern analysis and interpretation. The cultural impact of frontier tragedies like the Costner-Drury incident extends beyond historical documentation to influence literature, folklore, and artistic expression. Writers and artists have drawn inspiration from such cases to explore themes of human nature, survival, and the psychological effects of wilderness isolation. These creative interpretations help preserve cultural memory while providing emotional processing for difficult historical events. The legal precedents established by frontier courts dealing with ambiguous evidence continue to influence contemporary jurisprudence, particularly in cases involving circumstantial evidence and witness credibility. Judge Hartford's careful approach to the Costner-Drury case demonstrated principles of due process and evidence evaluation that remain relevant to modern legal practice, even as technical capabilities and procedural standards have advanced significantly. The seasonal rhythms of the Sierra Nevada wilderness continue unchanged since 1850, with spring snowmelt, summer drought, and winter storms following patterns that shape the experiences of Gold Rush-era prospectors. Modern visitors to the region experience similar environmental conditions, though improved equipment and communication systems reduce the psychological isolation that contributed to tragedies like the Costner-Drury incident. And perhaps most significantly, the site where Harold Costner and Benjamin Drury established their claim remains much as it was that terrible winter. The creek still flows over granite stones, bears still follow ancient trails through the forest, and the silence that once amplified two men's fears continues to echo among the pines. Time has erased the physical traces of their presence, but the questions raised by their story persist, reminding us that civilization's hold on human behavior may be more fragile than we care to acknowledge. The mountains keep their secrets well, and the truth of what transpired during those long winter months may never be fully known. What remains is a cautionary tale about isolation, desperation, and the thin line between survival and something far darker. In the end, nature claimed both men, though in very different ways, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and the enduring mystery of what drives ordinary people to extraordinary actions when pushed beyond their limits. The final entry in the Tuolumne County Archives, dated March 15, 1969, consists of a single memorandum from the county clerk's office. It states simply, Case File 1850-47 permanently sealed due to deterioration of physical evidence and absence of legal relevance. The bureaucratic language masks what had become an uncomfortable truth. Some questions are better left unanswered, some stories better left untold. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, a psychiatrist who studied the transcribed journal entries in 1966, concluded her analysis with an observation that would prove prophetic. The human mind, when stripped of social constraints and faced with mortal terror, may revert to mechanisms that civilized society cannot comprehend or forgive. In Harold Costner's case, the wilderness did not create a monster, it merely revealed what lay dormant beneath the surface. Her research was quietly shelved when the university administration deemed it inappropriate for public consumption. Dr. Whitfield died in 1971, and her complete notes were destroyed in accordance with her will, which specified that certain knowledge serves no beneficial purpose and should perish with its discoverer. The last person to visit the claim site with knowledge of its history was a park ranger named Robert Chen, who hiked to the location in 1987 while researching historical mining claims for a wilderness management report. He found nothing remarkable. No trace of human habitation, no unusual bear activity, no sense of foreboding. Just another clearing in an endless forest, remarkable only for its utter normalcy. Chen's report noted the site's coordinates and recommended its continued inclusion in the protected wilderness area. He made no mention of the 1850 incident, though his personal journal, discovered after his retirement, contained a single entry about the visit. Some places feel heavy with the past, even when nothing visible remains. The forest has reclaimed what was never meant to be disturbed. In 1992, a group of geology students conducting soil surveys in the area reported finding bone fragments that appeared unusually old. The fragments were collected and analyzed, revealing them to be from various large mammals, deer, bear, and what the laboratory identified as ungulate species consistent with regional wildlife. The analysis made no mention of human remains, though the fragmentary nature of the samples left room for interpretation. Today, the coordinates where Harold Costner and Benjamin Drury established their partnership lie within the Stanislaus National Forest, accessible only to experienced hikers willing to traverse unmarked terrain. The creek that once promised gold now flows undisturbed, except by seasonal wildlife. No memorial marks the spot, no trail signs acknowledge what transpired there. The bears that roam the area follow instincts older than human memory, their behavior governed by forces that predate civilization's attempt to impose order on wilderness chaos. They hunt, they feed, they survive, following patterns that neither judges nor psychiatrists can truly comprehend. Local historians occasionally field questions about the cannibal Prospector case, usually from amateur researchers who have stumbled across fragmentary references in old newspapers or academic footnotes. The standard response, developed over decades of uncomfortable inquiries, directs questioners to the official records, while noting that many frontier-era accounts contain elements of folklore that cannot be verified. The truth, if it can be called that, remains buried under more than a century of silence, official discretion, and natural reclamation. Harold Costner and Benjamin Drury entered the Sierra Nevada wilderness as partners seeking fortune. Only one emerged, and he carried secrets that died with him in a Stockton asylum room in 1854. The mountains witnessed what transpired during that terrible winter, but mountains do not testify in courts of law. The bears know what they were fed, but bears do not distinguish between willing gifts and desperate solutions. The forest floor absorbed what remained, but soil does not preserve moral judgments for future generations. What endures is the question that haunts every wilderness venture. How far from civilization must one travel before civilization's rules cease to apply? How long must one survive alone before solitude transforms survival into something unrecognizable? The case of Harold Costner and Benjamin Drury suggests that the distance may be shorter and the time briefer than any of us would care to believe. In the end, the Sierra Nevada wilderness keeps its own justice, swift, final, and utterly indifferent to human notions of right and wrong. It claimed both prospectors that winter, though in ways that defied understanding then and continue to disturb comprehension now. The last sound echoing through those mountain valleys was not the ring of pickaxe on stone or the rush of water over gold-bearing gravel. It was silence, vast, patient, and eternal, broken only by the distant call of bears moving through ancient forests, following trails that lead nowhere human maps can follow. And in that silence, some stories find their truest ending.